Hey, welcome back to the MWAD Hangout. We have our good friend again, Dr. Stacy Sims, who is adjunct professor of physiology over at Stanford. She is an elite coach, trainer around the highest levels of sport and performance. She's the CEO and founder of Osmo Nutrition, and my go-to on any idea I have about optimizing hydration or the nutrition or some of the issues around that, around sort of the exercise physiology. Let's be honest, you're one of the few exercise scientists I actually know, and physiologists I know. So poor Stacy gets a lot of questions from me. Welcome back. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks. No worries. I'm glad I'm your only sports scientist.
Well, frankly, I think anyone can only just have one. You can only have one on your speed dial. Well. Yeah. Just before I begin, I just got to, a couple times, every once in a while, I wear a shirt that another coach gives me. When I was out with Arsenal, they gave me their friends. But what's going to happen is that people are not even going to be able to listen to what we're talking about unless I address the fact that, hey, you can have other soccer loves too, football loves too, but it's just Arsenal. It's like wearing a Dallas Cowboys jersey. Freaks me out. So I'm sorry if you're offended, but the Gunners are my boys right now. So okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. The reason we're talking about this, as you know, is that we've just come through the CrossFit Games, and where it was really hot, maybe hotter this year, maybe muggier this year than it has traditionally been, and then there were some big aerobic requirements of the athletes during the second day of competition that, they had a couple of workouts, they had a day off, and then a big 40 to 50-minute aerobic piece. It was very hot, and we saw some athletes that maybe weren't as prepared for that level of heat. Could you, one, talk about maybe the implications of the training beforehand, what you saw as a professional looking in, not making judgments, of course, because that's not who you are, but really what are the lessons we can learn, and then we can talk about how you prepare athletes for heat. Is that reasonable?
Sure.
Great. So why don't you take a swing at the first one?
Okay. So when you're thinking about exercising in the heat, you can do a lot of power stuff and not be overly affected by how hot it is. But when you start adding in that longer aerobic, 45, 60-minute type aerobic component, there's a lot of things that take place. You start sweating a lot, and your core temperature goes up, your skin temperature goes up, and it's all about the gradient aspect of how you can offload heat. So if your internal temperature is going up and you're bringing more hot blood to the surface of the skin and trying to offload it through sweat, but then the environment is hot as well, your skin represents what's happening in the environment, and you can actually absorb heat. And if you're not aerobically conditioned to exercise in the heat, it becomes this X factor stress, where you start to release a lot of cytokines from the muscles, which increases inflammation and a systemic fever response. So you end up having all these things that compound the heat factor. And if you don't recover well enough from that through, your protein recovery and staying on top of hydration through watery fruit, veg, sodium, potassium, all that kind of stuff, then when you try to go do like heavy lifting, the power component of physical activity in the heat, your muscles aren't going to respond well because they haven't recovered well, and they can still be thermally stressed, and you have a higher metabolic output from trying to recover. So this is why when you're looking at what happened at the games, and then people are having really difficult aspects when you get into the power and strength componentry, it's because the muscles aren't firing at their optimal state, but people are pushing it to do that. And when you think about...
So, just real quick, that explains a little bit why people had this blowout experience. And it was hot and hard, no doubt, but then asking them to be powerful again in a snatch ladder in a couple hours, that really was an appropriate, difficult test, because you're asking the body to swing through a whole different physiologic range.
Exactly. And like I said, it comes down to being how well can your body offload the heat, as well as recover from that inflammation response that happens. And then critical, how fast can your muscles recover metabolically? How fast can they recover the ATP and the glycogen and all of those things that people are looking for in order to produce the great amount of power that you need for, like, the snatch ladder. And if you don't recover well, then you're more predisposed to things like rhabdo. And I understand there's a higher incidence of rhabdo in these games than normal, and it is part of that high stress of the muscle and not necessarily getting enough oxygen either to the working muscle. If your blood is going outward to dissipate heat, then your muscles are experiencing a little bit of hypoxia. So you have that hypoxia, you have that inflammation, you have inadequate metabolic recovery, and all this sets you up for lots of difficulties to have that peak performance.
One of the mechanisms for when we typically see rhabdo, not this is a conversation rhabdo is when people have fallen and have stayed in a position overnight and those tissues are in low blood flow. So people who have done no exercise but have fallen, when we don't see exercise-induced rhabdo, but the oxygen is as a piece, and it didn't even occur to me that as my body is trying to shed heat and bring blood to the skin, that I'm actually absorbing heat back in. I mean, I saw a lot of athletes didn't have shirts on. That's direct. Let me just mainline this UV right into my system. Does it also matter that in this population of athletes is a factor that we're seeing larger volume to surface ratio than we would typically see in the endurance athlete? The endurance athlete tends to be a little bit more lithe and whip it in stature, and that these athletes are power athletes who are carrying a lot more mass. Does that influence and impact the sort of the heat implications?
It does. Even in the endurance world, the more muscle mass you have, the worse you have with heat tolerance, because the blood flows to all muscle tissue, and because it needs oxygen and nutrients. Whereas if you're looking at a really thin ectomorphic runner and they don't have a lot of upper body mass, then they can handle much more of the heat, because really the blood is just going to work the leg and the glute muscles for the running action. But when you have someone who has a lot of upper body muscle and a lot of muscle mass per se, then the blood is being perfused everywhere, even though the muscle itself might not be working. So then you have the metabolic activity of the muscle increasing the heat, and then you have the hot blood circulating through all the muscle beds, and then you have this, I need to offload the heat, as well as the skin absorbing some heat, so it does become that contention factor.
Okay, so that's really, really helpful to know, to understand some of the background implication of the mechanisms for why we saw people so spun out afterwards, after just being heat. Because the casual moniker that's put on this is like heat stroke or heat stress, but that's really a loose blanket for some very complex, well-known, well-documented physiology around training and surviving in the heat.
Yeah, yeah.
Now you work with, let's see, I don't know, you've been to Ironman and around Ironman a few times. It's pretty hot there. You consult with the military who are in austere conditions. This is not the first time you have seen athletes really give her in the heat. And so can you talk about what you think are some of the best practices in your education towards these athletes in these other fields that we might be able to steal in? Because what I feel like has happened is that people have become very, very sophisticated around nutrition and training and programming and recovery and all of that, but we haven't necessarily applied that to situations where we're exercising extreme heat, and it doesn't matter so much because the wheels have fallen off because we haven't taken this test, because it's a real new sport and the athletes don't have a history of running the Badwater or surviving Kona, right?
Yeah. I kind of put it in the same category as the race car drivers that I work with, because they're in an enclosed capability and they're not really thinking about heat and performance. They just know that it's really hot in the enclosed car.
It's really hot. Like it's like 120, 130 degrees in there. And
there's no way to offload the heat because they're in a fire suit. So the best way that they can manage and mitigate is to become acclimatized or acclimate to the heat. And it's not like the old-fashioned, let's exercise in a neoprene wetsuit in a sauna kind of thing, because that doesn't really stimulate all the physiological processes that you want to be able to address exercise in the heat. So one of the things that I've been doing for about 10 years or so, that started when I was doing my PhD, was looking at using dehydration and heat stress to increase total blood volume. Because it's akin of going to altitude. You go to altitude to increase blood volume so that you can carry more oxygen and you can do more metabolic work when you're in a low oxygen situation. But if you do the same thing in the heat, then you get that total blood volume, but your body responds to a hot condition so that you start sweating sooner. Your body can understand this core to shell gradient and respond to it a lot faster. So I take my athletes somewhat passively dehydrated, like after a training session where they've been drinking as they normally do in the training session, and then put them in a sauna for up to 30 minutes. So they're passively dehydrated, and they're sitting in about 160, 170 degrees Fahrenheit. So all their thermoreg systems are super taxed, but they're not exercising. Their resting heart rate might be around 140 or 150, so it's pretty intense. And over the course of...
Let me just say, like, you're saying that as like a fat old guy, if I just dehydrate myself, I can get a good cardio workout in the sauna. This is genius, genius.
Sure.
No, I can stress myself right.
Yeah, but the high heart rate is because the blood is so thin because it's all being pushed out to the periphery to offload the heat and deal with this heat. And so, of course, your heart rate is going to be high because it has to pump faster in order to circulate this thicker blood because you're passively dehydrated up to the skin. So over the course of a week, your heart rate gets lower and lower, and you get to tolerate that sauna for up to about 30 minutes. The first time you go in, you might last 5 minutes, but by the end of 7 days, you're lasting 30 minutes.
Is that typical length? You'd maybe go for a week, or do you do that for 2 weeks? Or, well, if I knew I was going to be exposed myself to some brutal heat, like I'm going for a hike in the desert, and I could have access to a sauna kind of situation, is that something you'd recommend? A week of that or 2 weeks of that?
No more than a week. And then if you know that, say, you're going to go hiking in the desert and you're trying to prepare everything, you don't want to do it like the week and finish right the day before you go. We normally say, cut it back 10 days and finish about 5 days before you go, because then your body rebounds and you start to undue fatigue. And then you come back, and if you want to maintain some of that heat status, you can do some what we call top-ups. You either get back into the sauna or do some hot yoga kind of stuff. So your body's stressed in a hot condition, but you're not taxing yourself in that hot condition.
Oh, I didn't even think about the hot yoga. I mean, this may be the best application of hot yoga I've ever heard, because there's usually a Bikram studio around. I mean, and everywhere hot yoga around. So if I was an athlete, go do some of my training, I know I'm going to be exposed, go jump into a Bikram yoga class and just be cool, just see if I can survive that, because it's hot, it's Hades in there.
Exactly. Now,
we know that, I mean, there are issues around, when I start to overheat, what happens, like the thermal regulation goes up, what happens if I'm running in dehydrated? Or let's talk about body water. Can you differentiate that? Because it's not that I don't have a thirst drive, or can you just talk about a little bit of the implications around drinking and rehydrating? And when I say that, I'm not talking about just water, I'm talking about a specific intervention around maximizing body water. Can you just flesh some of those things out? So those are mistakes that people make, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, we do have this big debate going on of drink to thirst or, pre-hydrate, that kind of stuff. And there is some application for drink to thirst, but that's only your first session. Like, if you go into a session pre-hydrated because you have been eating watery fruits and veg, you might use a special application pre-hydration drink or something like that, and you know that you're hydrated. And you can go in, then you can rely on the drink to thirst for that one session. But the second session, a couple of hours later, you're not fully rehydrated, because it takes hours for your body to rehydrate, because it has to shift through so many different compartments. And you have electrochemical gradients, osmotic gradients, sodium, potassium, all these things that come into play. And it takes a good 3 to 24 hours to completely rehydrate. So if you go into your next session, your thirst sensation is already dampened, because as you become more dehydrated, you become less sensitive to thirst and food. So then if you start doing this drink to thirst in kind of a hot and hypohydrated state for your next session, you're going to just keep compounding that dehydration effect. And in the heat, this is where you start having problems. You can get away with it if it's temperate or cool, but when you're in the heat, you need as much body water to maintain blood volume in order to have effective circulation to the muscle, to the brain, to the skin, to offload the heat. So this is kind of where there's this critical hole missing in the science that's coming out between the ACSM side and the drink to thirst side. Because people think I'm drinking, I'm hydrated, but it's not that simple.
And in the drink to thirst, a lot of times we're talking about drinking water to thirst, right? Like I'm an average athlete. Most people are pounding way too much water. More importantly, not absorbing the water they're drinking. versus very specific, you know, and clearly the dangers of drinking too much water when you're hot is a problem, just plain water.
Yes.
But you're talking about a specific intervention and making sure that I'm drinking something with osmolality that reflects my blood, that there are lots and lots of good options out there to mix at a certain level that affect or can really does optimize my body's ability to uptake that water. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or uptake the fluid.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily osmolality either. It's how much sodium is in the drink. Because, I mean, you look at a typical sports drink that has a high osmolality and can be an effective dehydrator, but people can still experience some hyponatremia when they're drinking that because there isn't enough sodium to help pull that fluid through. So it sits in the gut, your body leaches sodium from other places to pull it in. So you want to look for something that is has a specific osmolality to pull it across, but also has a good amount of sodium to help with it. And there are a few things out there. I mean, like, you can even use miso or chicken soup the night before you're going to go exercise in the heat to pull in more body water and to pull in more sodium stores.
So, you know, you've talked about before, you know, hey, when I'm done, I'm an average athlete, I'm done training, have a little protein. I think you said maybe 20 grams, 20, 30 grams with some water. Just that can really pull in some fluids right away.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you're saying, though, and I just want to be really clear about this, is that if I am casual about my drinking to thirst, because coming up, I'm well prepared, I have a big effort, just can drink to thirst is fine because I can blow it out for 2 hours, I can even blow it out for 3 hours to sip, fine. But then the next session is really likely to be compromised because I haven't taken for the fact that I am behind. And then I start to see compounding. Can you talk about some of the implications of, and I think, I mean, you did a little bit, but when I am not optimally watered or fluided or hydrated, you know, what happens to make these things worse?
So if you're somewhat hypohydrated, then your heat tolerance is definitely blunted. What I mean by blunted is it's not a good thing. It's the fact that if you're hypohydrated and you go exercise in the heat, then your skin temperature goes up a lot faster because you don't have as much blood to circulate to the muscle and to the skin. So the skin ends up absorbing more heat, pulling it in. Also, what's really important for like your CrossFit athlete and having cognition and reaction time is that is muted as well, because you have smaller muscles that don't respond very well. They're becoming hypoxic with low blood flow. You also need to have a certain amount of glucose going to the brain. And the other critical thing that people don't realize is that your hypothalamus in your brain is your thirst and your temperature control center. So if your thirst is dampening, then that means some expression of nuclei are expanding in the hypothalamus, which affects central nervous system, it affects limbic system, it affects a whole bunch of other systems in the body that all become muted as well. So when you're thinking about low body water, it's not just the physical action of the blood flow being muted, it's also what's happening in the brain. And the more body water you lose, then the more your thirst becomes dampened, and the more you're predisposed to what we call systemic dehydration. And this is when you do a really hot, hard workout and then you're not hungry for hours and hours and hours, and you're just kind of lying on the couch and your metabolism is elevated and you can't drink and you can't eat. That's systemic dehydration. And that means that you have inflammation factors going on. You have blood that's not recirculating to the gut. It's trying to offload more heat. Your brain hasn't settled quite well enough to turn back on the hunger and the thirst sensation. So there's all these things that you have to think about. As you go through an event weekend, it's not the first WOD that you want to get through, it's the last one. And how do you prepare between each one to maximize your effect on the last one? And I don't think people really think about it so much. They're like, I got through this one, recovered, get to the next one, recover, but they're not doing the recovery or the hydration between. So it's always thinking about what are you doing for the next session? What are you doing for the next session?
There are companies like yours that have, you know, looking at, because we're talking about performance, not just talking about survival. Like, we know that you can run across the desert with no water. If I put a pot of gold 50 miles away from the desert, and you're going to get there with no, I know you are. Humans can go. But we're not just talking about drinking water till you flush out and have those problems. We're talking about how do we optimize performance. So give us, if I went out into my typical bike shop and purveyed what was out there, are those salt-heavy issues, are those going to be enough for me to replace that lost body water? Or am I going to need something that's a little bit more specific, not during exercise, but it's a post-training, and just, we're just like in 2 minutes, can you give me just like a little bit more granular guideline?
Yeah, ditch anything in the bike shop, except Osmo, of course. But no, for your recovery, using a protein-based drink is going to help rehydrate. And then using things like salted tomatoes and salted watermelon in the heat, cold salted watermelon.
Oh, how much salt? What are we talking about? Can I overdo it on the salt?
Just a sprinkle. If you're craving salt, then put a little bit more on, but maybe a 1/16 of a teaspoon. You're not talking a whole bunch, but just putting the salt on the watery fruit is going to help you pull in the water from the fruit. So looking at things like that, salting your salads, because when you are an athlete and you're sweating a lot, you do need sodium, and it doesn't have to be fancy salt. It can be normal Morton's iodized table salt.
Oh, what about my yuppie pink salt? I want that yuppie pink salt.
You can use yuppie pink salt. That's fine.
But so that just making sure that afterwards I'm just looking, hey, whatever I'm doing beforehand or during, optimizing my gut, the meal, which is a conversation we've had and will continue to have. But we're talking about getting ready for the next piece. I need to make sure that I have had some protein. Should I salt the protein? Is that a good thing to do?
No, they work on different mechanisms. So the amino acids work on what we call transcapillary fluid dynamics. So it works on a pressure sensation, whereas salt works with water on a different gated situation within the intestines. So there are two different mechanisms that happen in the body to pull fluid into compartments. So you don't have to salt your protein.
So first, best recommendation is, hey, let's go ahead and have 20 grams of protein, drink some water, and we're talking about like 12, 16 ounces. Is that what we're talking about in terms of the fluid for there?
Yeah. And if you're not having the protein mixed into the water, then put a 1/16 teaspoon of salt into that 16 ounces of water that you're going to drink.
There it is. There it is.
Absorbed.
Well, I'll tell you what, that helps immensely understanding a little bit. And then clearly, we have talked about wearing reflective clothing and cooling off and drop some other things, but mainly being able to pick your brain and talk about sort of the implications around, I think I'm getting some bad coverage here, some implications around the physiology is very useful and very helpful. Where can we find out more about you and your writing and your best practices, Stacey Sims?
Oh, I don't know. You can go to the Osmo site and also LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a lot more about me as a physiologist and a thermoreg expert. Osmo is more looking at hydration aspects of what to drink, how to drink, and that kind of stuff. So. And
what's that website?
OsmoNutrition.com.
Very well. Well, Dr. Stacey Sims, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for joining us on the Mobility One Hangout. We'll see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Bye.